Shalom and welcome to an exciting brand new program called the Knesset Report, and we are here in Jerusalem in the heart of Israel's democracy. And in today's program we are joined by Sharon Haskell, MK, member of Knesset for Likud, Michael McCann, the director of Israel-Britain Alliance, and David Parsons, the vice president of the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem. So wonderful that you can all join us. And in today's program, we're discussing the global rise of anti-Semitism. Sharon, thank you so much for hosting us here in the heart of Israel's democracy, which is the Knesset. Can you share with us how you got involved in politics and how you wanted to become a member of this house, and the fact that you are the second youngest member of the Knesset?
So it mainly comes from quite a few years of being very active in the political party as well. It was never my dream to be a Knesset member, but just probably in the past 5 years, I've started to become more and more involved, particularly with a lot of issues about our generation's issues like the cost of living and housing and education, understanding that if we're not going to step up and resolve these problems, no one's going to do that instead of us. And in Israel, as a very sort of a socialist economy, we even have some communist principles in the economy traditionally because of the way, to start an economy out of nothing, maybe sometimes it was needed. But today it actually just pushed back my generation and sort of prevent us from continuing and achieving and developing our economy and achieving a lot of things that we want. So my mission is to liberate our economy. So reduce taxes, reduce regulation, reduce the bureaucracy, and that's my mission. And I really understood that, we elect people and they're not fighting for it. So if we, the younger generation, are not going to step up, sit on these seats, and do what we want to see the change here in Israel, no one's going to do that instead of us. And this is when I made my decision to try to run for the parliament as well.
Fantastic. And from your perspective as a member of this house, the Knesset, what is your perspective on the glowing rise of global anti-Semitism or Jew hatred that we're seeing around the world today?
So it's quite worrying. I think we can see process that we've seen in dark times of history. Unfortunately, we see it more and more. Obviously, in Europe, there was always left a grain of the ancient anti-Semitism. If you look back in the beginning, people hated Jews culturally. They were different. They were a monotheistic religion, and they were persecuted for it, the Romans, the Greeks, etc. Then the rest of the world sort of accepted a monotheistic religion. So they started shifting the hatred towards Jews by putting stereotypes as if we're controlling the world. We have all the money. We all these sort of conspiracies of being pigs and things like that. And based on that, they started hating Jews. But that was also because we didn't have any other choice but to survive. So we found new ways to develop, and we developed many different systems. For example, for Jews, it was not allowed to be farmers. You weren't allowed to buy land. So you had to be a trader. So, and based on that, all the banking system, everything started developing. The Jewish community was very poor, but with the Industrial Revolution, suddenly the Jews who had more experience in that started rising as well. And we've also invested a lot in art and music and theater and writing, etc. And through that, we sort of started going through. And that's what we believe was right. This is part of the values that we grew up with. But people started attributing and hating the Jewish people for some of their successes, and started building this whole conspiracy, started to hate Jews, and they were, the excuse was the money and all these conspiracy theories. Now we've passed that because we've seen the Second World War and what happened there. And we understand that the hatred towards Jews, in the ancient anti-Semitism that was in Europe and in many Western countries sort of went under the surface, and people were ashamed of it. They weren't talked about because people would point out to them and tell them that it's not okay. But something very interesting is happening in Europe and in many other countries as well. These anti-Semitism, the ancient one, is being fueled up with a lot of immigration from the Middle East. We don't have a problem with immigration from the Middle East, but one of the cultural problems with it, it's quite accepted to hate Jews. It's normal. Jews are being blamed for all of their problems, all of their government problems, all of their financial problems. It's all about the Jews who are here in the Middle East. They talk about it in the education system, quite openly about it, in their television, in art. You know, in Iran, there's the yearly competition of anti-Semitic caricatures. People come from all around the region to come and see that. And so it's really acceptable and it's quite normal to hate Jews and to be outspoken about it. Coming with that kind of mentality to Europe is putting more fuel to an ancient anti-Semitism that was already there. And this is the rise of anti-Semitism that we're seeing now. Now, we know in the Western world what had happened because of motives of, describing in a stereotypic way Jews with all of these conspiracies and things like that. So they have a new excuse. The new excuse is Israel. And Israel is to blame about everything. And they come and they tell you, oh, we don't hate Jews. We just hate Israel. And that's the new excuse. And you know what? If you look on it, same as in the past, culturally, having a monotheistic religion, believing in that's what's right, that's what's just. We were killed for it. We were persecuted because of it. But this is what we believed is right, and we never turned back.
Michael, we're in a very strange situation where we're seeing an unprecedented rise of Jew hatred, not only in Britain, but also in Europe as well. And it's also linked to Israel as well. And we've been to Israel. We're here now, and it's an incredibly open and dynamic country and a democracy. What do you contribute this awful rise of anti-Semitism to?
Well, I think we've just had an expert explanation about how anti-Semitism has mutated over the centuries, over the millennia. And we're now in a situation where people hide their anti-Semitism for a deep and visceral hatred of Israel. If we could bring everyone in the world to Israel to see what a dynamic and diverse democracy it is, there wouldn't be any anti-Semitism because people would go away with an entirely different view. Sadly, we can't. So we have to try explain through organisations like the Israel-Britain Alliance in the UK about what Israel has delivered to this world and why it's important to keep the only democracy in the Middle East. What's really worrying in terms of from a UK perspective is where a once proud political party, which was in the main supported by the working classes in the UK, the Labour Party, has now mutated into an anti-Semitic party. You have Jeremy Corbyn as the leader of the Labour Party. Behind him, you've got, and forgive me using the full title, the Marxist millionaire Seamus Millen, so a very wealthy man who sends his kids to private schools and all the rest of it. It's do as I say, not as I do, who believes that Israel should not exist. Now, people have to really boil this down between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. You could be anti-Zionist before Israel was created. But now that Israel has been created, it's been reborn, then if you're saying you're an anti-Zionist, then you don't believe that Israel should exist as a country. And that's their deep-rooted view. And the problem is that Jeremy Corbyn has introduced a new generation of Labour Party supporters that believe that Israel shouldn't exist. And more importantly, he quietly supports them. So he turns around and he says, I haven't got a racist bone in my body. The only problem is, when it comes to anti-Semitism, he doesn't stand up against it. And we've seen countless examples of that happen. And that's why many people are now turning their back on the Labour Party in the United Kingdom.
And David, your experience of media, how much do you think that Western media coverage, whether it's from CNN or whether it's from the BBC or other Western news outlets, when they're covering the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and constantly referring to, even repeating the Hamas narrative, is actually fueling the rise of Jew hatred across the Western world?
I think there is a problem with the media bias and the slanted media coverage of this conflict, and I would say at times you could call it anti-Semitic when there's an obsessive focus on the Israel-Palestinian conflict and particularly Palestinian suffering. I'll give you an example. There was recently a report that Russian military forces operating in Syria since 2015, when they upped their presence and put boots on the ground in the Syrian conflict, they are responsible for more than 18,000 Arab deaths in Syria over the past 3 years. You do not hear this in the media. One Palestinian is hurt or perhaps killed trying to break through the border fence, and the whole world is covering it. And when you are obsessed with reporting every little, I don't want to belittle Palestinian suffering, but when you magnify it above all the other suffering in the world, or even something that Russia is doing right next door in Syria, it's anti-Semitic. It's an unfair standard.
And Sharon, I mean, we see beleaguered Jewish communities in Europe, particularly in France and particularly in Belgium, who are kind of fearful for the future. They can't show their Jewish identity in case they're fearful of attacks. There's been a recent poll in the UK where a third of British Jewry say that they will either make Aliyah to Israel or they will move out of the UK if Jeremy Corbyn becomes our next Prime Minister. What is Israel doing to help counter the rise of global anti-Semitism?
Okay, so first of all, there's not, our policies and the things that we do are limited to the state of Israel. There's only certain diplomatic tools that we can apply on other countries, like, for example, to cut diplomatic relationships or things like that, that we can actually apply in order to make sure. I was pleased to hear that the Labour Party here in Israel disconnected its relationship with the Labour Party in the UK after understanding that Jeremy Corbyn revealed that Jeremy Corbyn is an anti-Semitic. Some of the things that he did are completely unacceptable. It was very sad to see that as well. And I don't blame the Jewish community in England. They're waking up to a new dawn when they're being persecuted. And Jeremy Corbyn is backing that up. It means that he's legitimizing verbal and physical abuse, for example, of Jewish students on campuses in the UK. I visited recently in Oxford and Birmingham and Sussex, and students are quite worried about the rise of hatred towards them only because they are Jewish. Definitely not, they can't say that they're supporters of Israel.
Yeah. Michael, I want to bring in the issue of security because it's related. And the fact that at the present time, relations between Britain and Israel have never been stronger. But isn't it important to emphasise the contribution made to Israel to our own security, and the fact that the Israelis advise our military, our security services, they help us fight against Islamic extremism and terrorism, and that Israel is a model democracy. All the other Arab states should follow Israel's example, and Israel should be lifted up as an example of a shining light in a very, very dark region. Why is this message not being able to break through to, say, mainstream British society, or to those that hold deeply disturbing anti-Semitic views, like your former colleagues?
Well, we've been attending a Christian media summit this week, and we've heard about the whole dynamic between David and Goliath, and how Israel is now seen as Goliath rather than David, which is not true when you look at the territory and the neighbourhood it lives in. But there's an irony about the whole security issue. First of all, you might be surprised to learn that Jeremy Corbyn has 2 members of staff who have not been given House of Commons security clearance. That means that our security forces in the UK deem them a threat, and they won't give them security clearance. So they have to be escorted about the House of Commons because they can't do it freely, which normally would be the case. And the irony is that at the Labour Party conference a couple of weeks ago, they actually passed a motion saying that we should stop all arms deals with Israel. Unbeknown to them, what they don't realise is that Israel is actually supplying services to Britain. So it demonstrates that not only is there a tremendous amount of ignorance out there, but it demonstrates that they don't understand the relationship very well. I think there's a duty upon organisations for us to spread the word. We have to overcome the bias that exists in the media, and the only way you can do that is keep on promoting a sane, sensible message. And the difference between us, pro-Israel advocacy groups, and people who want to stand shoulder to shoulder with the state of Israel, is that we're telling the truth. And I think the truth will always trump the lies and the false narratives that are perpetrated by many people who do not want Israel to exist as a nation.
If I can just add one more sentence, it's also important to understand that those countries around us, they don't want to get the message of democracy, of liberties, of freedom, of equality. They fear it. The rulers all around the Middle East are fearful of their people understanding what an amazing system Israel have here of respecting women, of respecting minorities, of helping citizens. If their citizens are going to understand that, those leaders of all the countries around us are going to lose a lot of power and a lot of money.
That's a very, very good point. And David, I want to talk about your nation, the United States. And historically, the Jewish people have always been accepted in America, and even since George Washington was the first president after independence from Britain, we saw that he appointed some members of the Jewish community to be in his cabinet, and ever since then there is a very much acceptance of the Jewish community. But sadly, in recent years, we've seen a rise of anti-Semitism in the United States, so it shows that this is a global issue. What do you think are some of the policies that governments can put in place to lessen the effect and the impact of anti-Semitism?
Well, there has been a traditional bipartisan consensus in modern times in the Congress in support of Israel. I think when you talk about anti-Semitism in America, we're dealing now with the new anti-Semitism, not directed against the individual Jew, but against the Jewish state of Israel. And I think both the Republican and Democratic parties, they always had fringes out on the edge, Pat Buchanan on the right, different ones on the left in the Democratic Party. But they always kept them on the fringe, and both parties wanted to support Israel. Right now, the trend is the Republicans are very, very strong on Israel. Even at the grassroots, you do surveys, and it's 70–80% of registered Republicans are very pro-Israel, whereas the Democratic Party is at a tipping point, 50-50. A lot of it is they built a coalition of tribes, identity politics, and there's a lot of Arabs and Muslims in it, and there's trade-offs, and therefore a lot of them, to get a lot of other, the black community or Hispanic, some of them in the Democratic coalition, to get what they need, they have to agree with some of this anti-Israelism. And it's becoming very troubling. I think America, right now, a lot of people, they're worried about it, and they're trying to make sure the consensus of support, Democratic and Republicans, holds. I think every country is different in its political makeup, but I think whether it's Jews or Christians in every nation, whatever parties they're in, they have to build coalitions with other parties to support Israel and their nation. I think that's the lesson.
And Sharon, we're here in the one and only Jewish state in the world, and it was Theodor Herzl's dream, the Judenstaat, to create or re-establish the modern state of Israel as a solution for combating anti-Semitism. Can you share with us the difference Israel makes by being the home for the Jewish people, knowing that if there's any violent attacks against any Jewish communities in the world, they have a right to come here and become citizens of the nation of Israel?
So I think the most important thing is, first of all, that after so many years of being persecuted, of looking for some leader or some country to defend and protect us, finally we are capable of defending ourselves. We're not at the mercy of any kind of ruler or king or prime minister to defend us and protect us, as we've seen in many countries. Jews are actually being abused, not just verbally, but actually physically as well. A week and a half ago, I was in Paris for a delegation for 2 days. It was me, a few more parliament members, and the head of the Jewish agency. He was wearing a yarmulke. It's a Jewish little hat. And we were walking not in a strange neighborhood, in the middle of Paris in Champs-Élysées. And someone was walking in front of us, and as he was passing, he saw his yarmulke turning around, about to attack him physically. Thank God we had a security guard who immediately aggressively started yelling and being ready, and he backed off. But if we didn't have a security guard, he would have been physically attacked. That's a day-to-day reality for Jews, not just in distant places and countries, but in the middle of Europe, in the middle of main cities in Europe. And so understanding that here in Israel, it's a safe haven for us. No one will be able to attack us. We are here to defend ourselves. Our children are here to continue to build a strong defense mechanism system for us. Any Jew all around the world that will be persecuted is capable of coming here to Israel to seek for a shelter. If there's a huge humanitarian crisis like there were in Russia, in the old Soviet Union, where we brought more than 100,000 Jews here to Israel who were on the verge of starvation as well, in very bad economical situation. Same from Africa or Ethiopia, and many, many more countries throughout the years. So we're gathering the Jewish community here, the Jewish community who's been persecuted for many years. We have a strong defense. We'll continue to defend and protect ourselves. And this is the importance of that. We're able to dictate our own future. We were able to determine our own culture, to have our own education system, which is based on the values that we've been educated by for thousands of years, understanding what's just, what's right, and how we need to continue and, even advance humanity in so many different fields as
Absolutely. And Michael, I want to bring you into this equation, because isn't it important in particular that we recognise, our governments recognise, that Britain and Europe also recognise that by defending Israel, we're defending our own democracies, because the enemies of Israel that are perpetuating and fueling this rise of anti-Semitism and Jew hatred are also enemies of the West and enemies of democracy.
Absolutely, but they need to do more, because using the example of the UK, which I know most about, even the current government has to do more, because you have this battle between the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, who want to maintain a relationship with all the Arab countries, which is fair enough. So they'll say to Israel, we're going to criticise you from time to time, but don't worry, we're really still your friend. But they feed the false narrative. And those false narratives about hating Israel, the new anti-Semitism we were speaking about, in turn leads to people hating Israel, which in turn leads to people hating the Jewish people, which in turn leads to the type of hatred where people outrageously are attacked in streets. So therefore they need to do more, Simon, and it's not just Britain, it's pan-Europe. They need to get their act together in this to stop the oldest hatred rearing its ugly head again.
Absolutely. And David, how important is it that governments around the world actually adopt the working definition of anti-Semitism put out by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, that really say that if anyone says that Israel is a racist state, that Israel has no right to exist, then that's classified as anti-Semitism?
Yes. This definition, it took a lot of work to develop it. It includes, if you compare Israel to the Nazis, that is, even in the European Union has accepted that is anti-Semitism, and yet there are certain governments in Europe and a lot of individual politicians who make that comparison all the time, and by definition they're anti-Semites. And I think it's taken a lot of work. People like Elie Wiesel, Natan Sharansky, who have suffered for being Jewish, and to come up with this definition. And we're seeing that even the UN, some scholars, experts have called it the number one purveyor of anti-Semitism in our time. And we see it all the time in the way they're constantly ganging up on Israel, and some of the rhetoric there, which compares it to the Nazis, saying that what Israel does to the Palestinians is worse than the Nazis, that Israel's committing a genocide against the Palestinian people. I think this needs to be called out over and over. That qualifies you as an anti-Semite, and I don't want you in my government. I don't want you in my living room, on my television set. I reject it.
Sharon, on behalf of all of us here, and also our viewers, that we love Israel, we love the Jewish people. We are sickened by the shocking rise of anti-Semitism that we're seeing in Britain and Europe today. And so therefore we're showing our solidarity, and this is something that we believe is absolutely vital to fight against. But do you have a message for our viewers watching this program about why it's so important to stand up against the rise of Jew hatred that we're seeing in our world today?
Wow, I have a lot to say about it. I think that if we look on the course of history, there were very few stood by the Jewish people when they were persecuted because of their ethnical beliefs or their cultural beliefs. We believe in a monotheistic religion. We don't need to pray for statues or gods, and and we don't need to give them money or food. And we believed that there's only one God, and we need to pray and give Him our love. And if you look on how much persecution and murder occurred just for that sole belief, and no one stood beside the Jewish people until today, where it's so accepted and so normal. And it's similar throughout our entire history. And so I want to maybe say to your viewer one small thing. Thank you for being probably the first one throughout the Jewish history as well, for standing beside our people, understanding what is just and what is right, understanding that Israel stands for liberties, stands for democracy, stands for equality for women and minorities, and protecting them and defending them. And finally, there's a huge group, and we know many, many Christians as well that supports Israel, who finally will be remembered in history as the people who stood by the Jewish people in this amazing project, country, Israel, who is bringing the light and and liberties and democracy to a very dangerous and dark region here in the Middle East as well. So I would like to thank them.
Pleasure. Michael, what's your viewpoint on this?
Well, Warren Buffett was once asked, he once asked a Holocaust survivor, how would you define a friend? And the woman replied, someone that would hide me. I hope that, and I don't believe we'll ever have to do that again, but the reason and the way we will never have to do it again is people stand shoulder to shoulder with the State of Israel. The Israel-Britain Alliance is co-sponsoring this new programme, the Knesset Report, with Revelation TV. We want to spread that message even further in the United Kingdom and give people the opportunity to show their support in a tangible way for the State of Israel. So, Simon, thanks to Revelation TV, and let's hope we can make this a great success.
I hope so too. And finally, I'll give him a final word to David. David, your organisations bring thousands of Christians around the world to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles. What do you think that means for the Jewish people in the nation of Israel, to see so much Christian love and support for the one true Jewish nation, the nation of Israel?
Yeah, the Christian Embassy for almost 40 years now been hosting an annual celebration of the biblical Feast of Tabernacles here in Jerusalem. We get 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 Christians from about 100 countries each year. It's just not from Europe and the West, America and all. It's from all over the world now. 60% of our pilgrims this year were from Latin America, Africa, Asia. And for them to get out in the streets, and we have an annual march through the streets of Jerusalem, and to be able to tell the Jewish people, Israeli citizens, you're not alone, we're with you. It's a very wonderful dynamic, and we hear it over and over again that the people of Israel are very comforted and by this support. And I think it gives them more confidence in trying to work for peace with their Arab neighbors, knowing that there's Christian support behind them. In fact, the government of Israel has said that Christian support for this nation is a strategic asset for the Jewish state.
Fantastic. And I just want to thank you for all watching this programme known as the Knesset Report, in which we're highlighting the vibrancy of Israel's democracy here in Israel's parliament, the Knesset.